Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13 for part 2 of the Indrid Cold and Woody Derenberger story. I'm your host, Matt, and last week we dove into the extraordinary story of Woodrow Derenberger, an ordinary West Virginia sewing machine salesman whose life was forever changed on November 2nd, 1966. That evening, driving home on Interstate 77, Woody encountered a small metallic craft and its occupant, a being who identified himself as Indrid Cold, a searcher from the planet Lanulos. What started as a brief roadside encounter quickly escalated into something far more complex. Cold didn't just appear after that first meeting. He allegedly began regular telepathic communications with Derenberger and even visited the family home. Woody claimed he was taking on incredible journeys, first to earthbound locations like Iraq and Afghanistan, then to other worlds entirely, Lanulos, Venus, and even Saturn's rings. But going public with the story came at a devastating personal cost. Derenberger lost his job, his family faced relentless ridicule, and their once stable middle-class life crumbled under the weight of constant media attention and social ostracism. His wife Connie was forced into an impossible position. His children endured schoolyard taunts, and yet through it all, Woody never wavered from his account. The story became even more intriguing when independent witnesses came forward confirming that they'd seen the same craft that night. Professional investigators concluded that Derenberger was neither a fraud nor mentally unstable. He genuinely believed these encounters were real. If you haven't listened to part 1, I highly recommend going back to last week's episode and listening to everything from there so you can really get the full story of Woodrow Derenberger and his encounter with Cold and all the details of what they spoke about, where they went, the media attention, and all of that. But tonight, as we dive into part 2, we're going to explore how this already incredible story became intertwined with one of America's most famous cryptid legends, and how the truth may be even stranger than we imagined. Here's where the story takes a fascinating turn into how legends are born, transformed, and distorted. Remember how I mentioned that Derenberger described Cold's face as very normal? Well, that's not how most people know Indrid Cold today. Somehow Cold became known as the Grinning Man or Smiling Man, often depicted with an uncanny, inhumanly large smile that stretches impossibly wide across his face. But here's the crucial detail that reveals how this folklore evolves. Derenberger's story never specified an unusual grin. He specifically said his face was very normal. This transformation came largely through the work of a researcher named John Keel, who was investigating the wave of strange phenomena that swept through West Virginia in the mid-1960s. And according to folklorist David Clark, Keel's own distinction between fact and fiction was a very fine one. Keel linked Cold to other grinning stranger sightings and helped popularize the connection between Cold and the Mothman reports that began in Point Pleasant on November 15, 1966, just 13 days after Derenberger's encounter. The connection between Indrid Cold and the Mothman has long been a subject of speculation among paranormal researchers. Both figures emerged around the same time in 1966. Both were linked to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and both were associated with ominous, unexplained events leading up to the tragic Silver Bridge collapse. But to understand how Indrid Cold became the Grinning Man, we first need to understand John Keel himself. He was born in Hornell, New York, and he was fascinated by magic at an early age. Keel was known as Houdini by his friends and would later become a prominent journalist and ufologist credited with coining the term Men in Black. Keel was a Fortean researcher, an amateur magician, a UFO enthusiast, a globe-trotting reporter, and the author of a series of stranger-than-science books like Strange Creatures from Time and Space from 1970 and The Eighth Tower from 1975. But it was his investigation into the Point Pleasant phenomenon that would define his legacy and forever kind of alter how we understand the Indrid Cold story. Keel spent over a year in Point Pleasant where he saw and experienced many of the strange manifestations personally. This wasn't armchair theorizing. Keel immersed himself in the community. He interviewed witnesses firsthand, and he claimed to experience the phenomena himself. His descriptions were evocative and positively just dripping with atmosphere. And when Keel wrote about two young people driving like lunatics to escape the Mothman as he dive-bombed their van, your pulse was racing as you read it. But here's where it gets kind of complex, is that Keel wasn't just reporting these events, he was interpreting them, connecting them, weaving them into a larger narrative. His approach blurred the lines between journalism and storytelling, between documentation and theory building. In doing so, he transformed isolated incidents into this interconnected web of high strangeness that would influence paranormal research for decades to come. Keel's theoretical framework was revolutionary for its time. Rather than viewing UFO encounters as simple alien visitations, he proposed what he called the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, the idea that these phenomena originated from parallel dimensions or alternate realities rather than distant planets. In his framework, entities like Indrid Cold weren't extraterrestrial visitors, but something far stranger. They were interdimensional tricksters who had been interacting with humanity throughout history, simply changing their masks to match contemporary fears and expectations. This theory explained why ancient peoples reported encounters with fairies and spirits and demons, while modern witnesses describe aliens and UFOs. The entities remain the same, only their disguises evolved. In Keel's view, Indrid Cold was just the latest persona adopted by these ancient intelligences to manipulate and confuse human perception. And we can't tell the Indrid Cold story without mentioning what happened 13 months later. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant, West Virginia collapsed, killing 46 people. However, the story is preceded by months of weird sightings, ominous meetings, and events that some would consider extraordinary. This tragedy became the capstone of what researchers now call the Point Pleasant Prophecies, a period of intense paranormal activity that included Mothman sightings, Men in Black encounters, and other strange phenomena. Some researchers have suggested that Indrid Cold's appearances were somehow connected to these events, though Derenberger himself never claimed any prophetic knowledge about the bridge collapse. The tragedy added a dark undertone to what had been, in Derenberger's mind, a largely benevolent contact experience. It raised uncomfortable questions. If Cold was real and possessed advanced knowledge, why didn't he warn about the impending disaster? And the story of Indrid Cold becomes even more intriguing when compared to another alleged alien contact case from the same era, the tale of Valiant Thor. Now, we'll get into a full episode on Valiant Thor, but the overview, according to this tale, Valiant Thor was a humanoid extraterrestrial from the planet Venus who arrived on Earth with a mission to share advanced technology, promote messages of peace, love, and unity, and help humanity avoid self-destruction. The parallels between these two cases are striking, and they suggest either a pattern in how contact experiences are reported, or possibly a shared cultural template for benevolent alien encounters in the Cold War era. In 1957, the Pentagon received an unexpected visitor. His name was Valiant Thor, and allegedly he was from Venus. His mission on Earth was to convince world leaders to deactivate their nuclear arsenals. And this was less than a decade before Derenberger's encounter with Cold in 1966, placing both stories within the same period of intense Cold War anxiety. Now, Thor claimed to be from Venus, and Cold had showed Woody what Venus was like, despite the fact that by the 1950s and 60s, scientists already knew that Venus was this hellish world with a surface temperature, hot enough to melt lead. The scientific impossibilities suggest that either both accounts were fictional or that the entities were deliberately providing false information about their origins. Valiant Thor was described as friendly, charming, and respectful, much like Derenberger's description of Cold. Both entities presented themselves as benevolent visitors concerned with humanity's welfare, particularly regarding nuclear weapons and warfare. While Cold allegedly made contact with an ordinary citizen, Valiant Thor was said to have met with President Eisenhower and Vice President Richard Nixon for an hour, and then was put on VIP status and shuttled back to the Pentagon, where he stayed for 3 years working with top scientists and government officials. Both entities were described as remarkably human-like, with only subtle differences distinguishing them from ordinary people. The humanoid appearance was crucial to their ability to move through human society undetected. Both stories center on warnings about humanity's destructive tendencies and offers of guidance toward a more peaceful future. In an era dominated by fears of nuclear annihilation, both entities allegedly brought messages of hope and technological solutions to human problems. And the Valiant Thor story sounds suspiciously like the plot of a TV show. And both stories have the quality of science fiction narratives perfectly calibrated to address the anxieties of their time. They offer reassurance that someone somewhere cares about humanity's survival and is actively working to prevent our self-destruction. The question becomes, were these separate independent contact experiences, or were they expressions of the same cultural phenomena? The similarities are so striking that they suggest either a real pattern in how advanced beings interact with humans, or a shared psychological template for how humans in the 1950s and 60s imagined benevolent alien contact would occur. The story of Cold doesn't end with Woody Derenberger. His daughter also claims that Indrid still visits her to this day. And think about that for a moment. If it's true, that means this contact has spanned generations, continuing long after the original witness passed away. Another encounter with the Grinning Man occurred in Point Pleasant, again in 1966. This encounter takes place in a rural home owned by the Lilly family, and they were dealing with what they thought was poltergeist activity in their home. And the connections between these various phenomena, UFO encounters, cryptid sightings, poltergeist activity, suggest either complex interconnected paranormal event or the way fear and suggestion can spread through a community. So what really happened to Woody Derenberger? The theories are as varied as they are intriguing, and each offers kind of a different lens through which to view this case. First, you have the psychological theory. Some researchers suggest it was entirely psychological, that Derenberger sincerely believed it all happened, but that something in his mind created these experiences. Carl Jung's theory of splits in the unconscious and semi-autonomous personalities has been cited as a possible explanation. Essentially, Carl Jung believed the human psyche can split, with parts of the unconscious forming their own kind of semi-autonomous personalities, kind of like emotional subcells that act independently. These fragments that he called complexes can influence our behavior without us realizing it, sometimes even feeling like another person has taken over. Perhaps Indrid Cold was a manifestation of Derenberger's unconscious mind, given form and voice through the stresses of modern life. And then you have the military theory. Others propose something more terrestrial but equally mysterious, that Indrid Cold and his associates had intelligence connections, or piloted an early aerial drone designed by the U.S. military. This theory suggests the possibility of a psychological operation, with Cold and others trying to make locals think military drones were from outer space. Given the Cold War tensions of 1966, such operations weren't really that unthinkable. There was something that you could see the government doing at this time. And then there's the trickster theory. John Keel himself later theorized that UFOs and contactee experiences weren't interactions with aliens at all, but what he called an ancient trickster-type entity. And we discussed this earlier. It has simply changed its appearance over time, from fairies and spirits in the past to UFOs and aliens in the modern era. In this view, Indrid Cold was just the latest mask worn by this intelligence that has been interacting with humanity for millennia. Think back to stories you hear in biblical times where they tell all these stories of angels and demons and things coming down from heaven, and that's what they understood at the time. And now in a modern time, when we think of stuff coming from the sky, we think of aliens and extraterrestrials. So this theory is saying that it's the same beings, they just took the form of what the people there at the time would understand. And then you have, of course, the hoax theory. Some people dismiss the entire story as an elaborate hoax. Though this theory does struggle to explain Derenberger's consistency over decades, the corroborating witnesses, and really the personal cost he paid for this. If this was a hoax, eventually he would be like, all right, look, enough is enough. I made the whole thing up. This man lost his job. He lost anything semblance of a normal life that he had. He wasn't making money from this. His life was ruined, essentially, from this experience. The goal of any hoax is to either gain notoriety or money. And if he was faking this whole thing, he was not getting either of them. Maybe a little bit of notoriety, but it was mostly negative. So you would think if it was a hoax, eventually he would have said, enough is enough. This was all a hoax. And lastly, there's the collective unconscious theory, which, building on both Jung and Keel's ideas, some researchers propose that figures like Indrid Cold and Valiant Thor represent archetypal manifestations of humanity's collective unconscious, psychological projections of our deepest hopes and fears about contact with the unknown. In this view, the similarities between contact stories reflect shared human psychological patterns rather than actual encounters with the same entities. But then we run into the scientific problem. The one major issue with taking Derenberger's claims literally is the science doesn't add up. His descriptions of Venus as an agricultural garden planet and Saturn as inhabited directly contradict what we know about these celestial bodies. By the 1980s, many ufologists had dismissed his stories precisely for this reason. But here is the intriguing question. If Derenberger was having genuine contact with an alien intelligence, why would that intelligence provide scientifically inaccurate information? Was Cold lying? Was he mistaken? Was he describing different planets with the same names? Or does this point to a more earthly explanation for the experiences? The scientific inconsistencies don't necessarily invalidate the entire experience. They might simply suggest that whatever happened to Derenberger wasn't what he interpreted it to be. And the same scientific impossibility plagued the Valiant Thor story, which claimed Venus as the entity's origin. The fact that both of these stories shared this one glaring scientific error suggests either that both were products of the same pre-space age assumptions about planetary habitability, or that the entities deliberately provided false information to conceal their true origins. Woody Derenberger wrote about his experiences in the book Visitors from Lanulos, My Contact with Indrid Cold, which was first published in 1971. And prior to its reissue, there were only about a half dozen copies remaining in the world's library system, with the rest trading for thousands of dollars each. And that kind of rarity and value speaks to the enduring fascination with this case. And the Indrid Cold story itself has become inextricably linked with the Mothman legend, particularly through John Keel's influential book, The Mothman Prophecies, which is what the movie was based on. And it's been explored in documentaries, films, and countless online discussions. And the story has kind of taken on a life of its own, evolving and growing with each retelling. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of the story isn't whether it's true or false, it's what it tells us about the human experience in the mid-20th century. Here was a man living through the Cold War, a time of intense global anxiety and technological paranoia, claiming contact with benevolent beings who offered messages of peace and universal love. Whether Derenberger's experiences were real contact, profound psychological manifestation, or something else entirely, they served as a counter-narrative to the fear and uncertainty of the times. In an era of nuclear weapons, Vietnam War, and social upheaval, the story of Indrid Cold offered hope that somewhere out there, someone cared about humanity's well-being. The message Cold allegedly delivered was profoundly humanistic. We eat, we breathe, we sleep, we bleed even as you do. In a time when the other was viewed with suspicion, whether communist, foreign, or simply different, Cold's message was one of fundamental similarity and shared experience. And to be honest, this message sounds like something that would manifest in today's social climate. We are at an all-time high of tension and anger and everything worldwide, and if Cold was a psychological manifestation or if it was something else, this would be a perfect timing of hearing a similar story come through, of something to show us, something humanistic. That quote, that we eat, we breathe, we sleep, and we bleed even as you do, that even something as foreign as an alien contact could be very similar to all of us here. And even the name Indrid Cold has an otherworldly kind of poetry to it. Cold, suggesting distance, space, the void between stars, but also clarity and precision. And Indrid, a name that sounds like almost Celtic, ancient, and timeless, whether real or imagined, is a name that sticks in the mind. And the parallel with Valiant Thor adds another layer to this cultural meaning. Both stories emerged during America's most anxious decade, offering reassurance that advanced beings were watching over humanity's dangerous transition to the nuclear age. They represented hope that someone with superior knowledge and benevolent intentions was working behind the scenes to prevent humanity's self-destruction. And today, more than a half century later, the case of Indrid Cold and Woody Derenberger remains one of the most fascinating and complex stories in UFO lore. It shows us how personal experience, cultural context, and media influence can combine to create legends that persist long after their origins. The transformation of Cold from Derenberger's normal-faced visitor to the popular culture Grinning Man illustrates how folklore evolves, how details are added, subtracted, and modified as stories pass from person to person, researcher to researcher, generation to generation. Woody Derenberger paid a heavy price for sharing his story. His job, his family's peace, his reputation, and ultimately his financial security. But he never backed down from what he claimed was the truth. In an age of social media and instant communication, it's hard to imagine the courage, or perhaps compulsion, it took to maintain such an extraordinary claim in the face of decades of skepticism and ridicule. And the parallels with the Valiant Thor case suggest that the Indrid Cold story may be part of a larger pattern of contact narratives that emerged during the Cold War era. Whether these stories represent genuine encounters with otherworldly beings or their physical manifestations of this collective anxiety or deliberate disinformation campaigns, they reveal something profound about the human need for hope and guidance during times of existential crisis. The case of Indrid Cold and Woody Derenberger challenges us to consider the nature of reality, belief, and the stories we tell ourselves about our place in the universe. It asks uncomfortable questions about the relationship between truth and experience and between what happens and what we think happens. Was Woody Derenberger visited by a being from another world? Was he the victim of an elaborate psychological operation? Did he experience a profound manifestation of his own unconscious mind? Or was his story, like that of Valiant Thor, a cultural artifact that reveals more about human psychology than alien visitation? And really the most honest answer is that we simply don't know. But going through these questions, you do kind of learn something valuable about ourselves and our fears and our hopes and our endless capacity to find this meaning in the mysterious. And really, that might be the most important lesson to learn from all of this. Thank you guys so much for tuning in for part 2 of the Indrid Cold Woody Derenberger story. I love this case. I have always been fascinated with this from the first time I heard it, which coincidentally I heard during a Mothman documentary, which stay tuned because Mothman is coming up next week, which may or may not be another 2-parter. So just keep that in mind. But it's just one of these stories that just sticks with you, and seeing how it changes from, this normal face guy to the Grinning Man to being benevolent to being, a horror type villain to in the Mothman Prophecies where you don't see him, but you hear him on the phone and he's got this creepy voice where Woody in real life said that he was just a normal guy. And in the movie, they portray him as this creepy kind of scary figure. It's just fascinating the way this story has changed and evolved and what is true and what's not true. And it's just really interesting to think about. And I love having the opportunity to tell the story here on the podcast so you guys can, hear everything about it and kind of get sucked into it like I was. And if you guys like the episode, go on whatever podcast app you use, whether it's Apple, whether it's Spotify, whether it's any other app that you're using, and like the show, share the show with all your friends, share the show with your coworkers, share it on a billboard down the highway in your town, which I'm not going to pay for. So you can go ahead and do that. That would be fantastic. But just sharing the show with anyone you can think of who might be interested, the other nutcase in your family who talks about aliens at family gatherings, let them know about it because for sure they're going to want to listen. Again, follow us on all the social media, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube at Paranormal Directive 13. I post on there every day. Also, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Paranormal Directive 13. We're up to, I think, 6 minisodes now. They come out every single Thursday. There's a new minisode on there, and then as well as pictures of every single case that we do a story on and some extra stuff on there too. And then send an email, paranormaldirective13@gmail.com. Any stories, anything you want me to look at, send it over there, and I will do either a minisode or a post or a full-on podcast episode on it. And remember, next time you're face-to-face with a being from another world, maybe it's been here since the beginning of humanity, or maybe it's never been here at all.